Hi, I'm Mina Krenz. I'm part of the 2023 class at University of Minnesota Medical School, Twin Cities campus.
And I'm Jenna Robinson. I'm also a member of the 2023 class. And today we're talking with Ismael Dore, an organizer with ACLU Minnesota, about the intersection of voting rights, racial inequities, and health as part of Twin City Medical Society's Community Conversation Series. Welcome, Ismael.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Ishmael, could you tell us a little bit about the work you do around voting and voting rights at ACLU?
Yes. Well, here at the ACLU of Minnesota, I'm leading this year's voter outreach campaign. Some of my work consists of educating community members of the elections, of this year's elections, and the various races that will be taking place, but strictly from a nonpartisan standpoint. I host various Know Your Rights live webinars, which are posted to our Facebook Live account, to our Facebook account using Facebook Live. Where I specifically talk about voting rights like eligibility, if you're formerly incarcerated, what are your rights to vote, early voting, voting by mail, voting absentee, how to track your ballot, finding your polling locations, distributing voter guides, telling folks about important dates and deadlines. For example, our deadline to pre-register to vote was just a couple days ago. So with that being said, I'll create and execute strategies to register eligible voters, strategically pinpointing counties and precincts with low voter turnout percentages, and targeting said counties or precincts in efforts to make sure that we can make sure that as many voices are heard throughout our electoral process. This consists of recruiting and coordinating volunteers to help with this voter outreach, hosting phone banks, kind of like I was doing today, text banks, voter registration stations. I'll have them set up in areas. For example, a couple of days ago, seeing as though it's the last day to pre-register on the 13th, I had 4 different stations set up across North Minneapolis in areas where a lot of the voter turnout is not as high as other areas in Minnesota. And it went well. We had a great event. And so that being said, there's a lot of things that I do when it comes to voting, pretty much anything and everything to make sure that people's voices are being heard and the community is speaking up about issues that matter to them while not endorsing any candidate.
Yeah, well, thank you. That is such great work that you do. That sounds like it was successful or has been successful. Another question we have for you is, what do you see as the intersection between like voting rights and racial inequities? And can you speak to how that intersection ends up impacting individuals and community health?
Well, personally speaking, I know that historically many aspects of our system were created without Black and brown individuals in mind. And our electoral system is one of those aspects. And it was created without even women in mind. At first, women didn't even really have a right to vote, let alone Black and brown bodies. So this being part of our electoral system, like this being part of the history, many people acknowledge it, but it causes them to be reluctant to take part in something that they know wasn't really meant for them. To many people, Black and brown folks who don't take part in the elections, it's just, they're going to do what they're going to do anyway. It doesn't matter, And so I think another thing that's really impacting the fact that Black and brown bodies don't get out to vote more is a lot of the misinformation that we see out there and the disinformation. So, I mean, that's about what I can say for that part. Does that clarify? Does that answer your
Yeah,
question? Sorry.
yeah, definitely. I'm wondering, so I think some folks might not be thinking about like the barriers they see or barriers to voting or voter suppression in Minnesota because those barriers aren't as like highly visible as in other states like in Georgia or Texas. So could you tell us a little bit about like barriers to voting in our state specifically and how those targets, how that targets minorities?
Well, like I said earlier, like misinformation and disinformation is probably the biggest barrier to voting, because many people aren't even aware of certain things. You know, many people have this idea like, okay, if you vote, you're not allowed to vote if you have a felony, for example. And we know mass incarceration is one thing that affects Black and brown communities on a large scale, and it's actually disproportionate to white communities, but that's another discussion. And many people have in mind that, oh, if you catch a felony, like, you're not allowed to vote. But here in Minnesota, as long as you finish parole or felony probation and you're not on any type of supervision, you actually do have your rights restored to vote, and you can partake in the election. So this year, I actually encountered a large number of people who were just unaware of that in and of itself, and people who were eligible to vote years ago, you know, just not taking part in the process because they, in their mind, they have this felony on their record. Their voice doesn't matter anymore. And so there's a lot of things that just have to be changed just so we can make sure that everybody's voice is being counted for in these elections. And we're not just, you know, counting votes for people who, you know, do what they're supposed to do and, you know, take part in the elections, but everybody has to have a say. Otherwise, our election process isn't working. It's only one group of people who are driving the country forward, and things are working in their way, but not working for everybody else. So if we can eliminate those barriers, if we can start putting out more information for people, for them to be available, for it to be available to them, I believe we can have a larger voter turnout. And also another thing, I don't know if I'm supposed to be speaking on this, the Electoral College, that's another thing in and of itself that I believe takes away from the integrity of the popular vote. And those are just my thoughts on that situation.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of important points there. That's definitely, there's so many barriers to voting, and it's so important to reassure voters that their voice does matter, and, you know, we're working on reducing those barriers. And so kind of going off of that, I'm wondering if you can like speak on, you kind of touched on this, but speak about some of the efforts that activist organizations, either ACLU or other ones that you've been involved in, what they're doing in Minnesota to reduce these disparities.
Well, yeah, there are a few organizations I can name. I can go for days. I can list organizations for days that are, you know, doing this work. For example, Black Civic Network, they've been out here for a while doing their thing to build a Black community voter base, which actually represents the Black community's political and economic interests. We have the NAACP. I know they're out here doing the work to get people registered to vote, especially in Black and brown communities. Minnesota Normal, which is leading the front behind registering people to vote, to get active, to use their vote on issues relating to marijuana legalization, and, you know, dealing with the formerly incarceration of people who've been, you know, incarcerated for having marijuana back in, you know, the 80s and the 90s, in a time where they were a lot more strict. So, and there's also the Anika Foundation, Ayata Leads. I know Mother's Love is doing the work. So many organizations, and it's really great to see that here in Minnesota we have all these organizations that are doing this work and trying to get the community active, especially in a time like this where we're dealing with COVID, we're dealing with many things. I won't speak about because I'm nonpartisan, of course, but we're dealing with many things, and, you know, it's great to see that we have community members still out here doing the work to make sure that we're not losing focus. We're still keeping our heads up. We're still pushing for what we want, and hopefully, you know, sooner or later things will start to get a lot better for Black and brown individuals. And yeah, hopefully we'll talk less about racial inequities, because we'll start to see racial equities, and so just one step at a time, though. Right now, it's been a long fight, but the fight continues, I guess.
Yeah, well, you're doing a lot of great work, so hopefully we can get more people like you out there doing all that. So we appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, and speaking of that, so what can we do as med students or physicians and other healthcare professionals to support the work that you're doing?
That's a good question. Well, medical students, you guys are very important to us, especially the people who are on the front lines, you know, putting their lives at risk to go vote, you know, while there's a pandemic going on, possibly, you know, making sure that the data align is right with whatever with whatever is going on as far as like health wise. And there's a lot of things you can do, really. Putting the information out there, making sure people are aware of their rights, talking about mental health as well as, you know, historical trauma and why things are the way they are right now, and how we can move things forward and how we can come up with the solutions to create healthy communities. I believe that's where medical students, I believe, can take charge and lead the front and making sure that people are safe and healthy.
Yeah, right. And voting has a lot to do with health, right? So we can start with voting and see where we get.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for interviewing with us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, this has been so informative, and yeah, it's great to talk with you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.